Hello, Jeremy.
Hey, Jay. It's great to be here.
I'm glad you are here. Let me go through a little bit of an intro before we get to you, Jeremy, if that's okay. So for
Let's do
those
it.
that are watching, welcome to Cultivated Live for Wednesday, February 21st, 2024. We're also calling this episode 2. I don't know when we'll stop numbering them in single digits, but we will do that at some point. And as we noted yesterday on this program, our goal at Cultivated feedback. As we noted yesterday, our goal has been to be reader first, providing the cannabis industry with the most important, insightful, and useful information to our audience, largely coming from Jeremy, who's here with us today. But until now, that's mostly or entirely been through our daily newsletter, Cultivated Daily, which you should absolutely subscribe to, and I'll put in the notes how to actually do that. But we also want to meet the industry where they are, and they are everywhere, obviously. And so we have the newsletter, which goes to emails. We fill our social feeds as well. And now we are doing this live stream through LinkedIn, which many of you are watching, and then through our YouTube channel as well. And here's what we'll do. We're going to recap the most pressing news of the day, often with a guest, in this case, Jeremy, who's more of a co-host than a guest, but it'll be Jeremy. And then we'll dive into conversation with our guests sort of to talk about the news. Again, the feed is on LinkedIn and also on YouTube, and we'll put how to follow both of those things as we go. And we're going to try to keep this stream every day to about 20, 25 minutes. Yesterday, we were at 26.5 minutes, but don't hold us to the tight timeline, but we're going to try to get you out relatively quickly because we know everybody is busy. Let me introduce guest / co-host Jeremy from the founder and co-founder of Cultivated Media. Jeremy, welcome.
Thank you, Jay. It's good to be here. It's fun to do this live.
It is fun to do it live.
Yeah.
It adds a level of not necessarily mystery, but you don't know what's going to happen. Sort of like the first run of SNL at 11:30 Eastern time. But you have a long history at the intersection of journalism and cannabis. What was your path? I actually don't even know this, but what was your path to the cannabis beat at Business Insider?
It was a meandering path, and I'll keep this as pithy as possible. It was never a job I thought I would have, but if you asked me when I was 16, I would have said this was my dream job. So, knowing that, I think all good. I think maybe it was also predestined for it in some ways. So I started a Business Insider way back in 2015. I was on the breaking news team. And at that time, the business model was really to do what we called flood the zone, which was aggregate a lot of stories. It ended up being the run up to the 2016 election. None of us knew it was going to happen, but I ended up writing a lot about Donald Trump, a lot about Trump tweets, a lot about politics. And that was trial by fire to know that I never wanted to be a political reporter. Great experience. Never want to do it again. After that, I wanted to change. And so I rotated, the good thing about businesses that are at the time is they, allowed you a lot of editorial freedom. So I rotated around a number of desks. I covered science, I covered innovation, I covered venture capital. I eventually landed on the finance desk, and not because I was interested in finance, just purely because the company was staffing up really good editors on that team, and I wanted to learn from them. So I covered a little bit of like bank earnings, pretty boring stuff, but I learned how to read a balance sheet. I learned how to kind of speak the language of finance.
Most people in cannabis, actually.
I'm not going to say I'm an expert at it, but I know my way around it. Anyways, so I wrote in about 2016, I wrote some one-off stories. One of them was a dispensary, Harborside, that won a court case in Oakland. And I got more feedback from that story than anything I'd written previously. I think, people seemed like they thirsted for coverage of the space. And so I was interested in it. Like frankly, I smoked weed and I was interested from that perspective, though I wasn't totally aware of the complexity and the nuance, of cannabis legalization. Anyways, I started writing, one story a week, became 2 stories a week, became 30% of my time, became 50% of my time, to the point where I got hauled into a meeting with some higher ups and they said, stop writing about cannabis. We don't want to tacitly endorse legalization. We think you're way ahead of this. Stop. So I had to stop, and that was a really frustrating experience. But my editor at the time, she had my back and she was like, look, I think we're going to miss the curve here. So I think you should keep doing it a little bit surreptitiously. So I did, much to the higher.
Much like how people use weed, actually.
Basically, yeah, I was a little under the table. My parents didn't know about it, or maybe they did, So anyway, so I was doing that, and eventually, I decided enough was enough, and I thought that I was getting so many good interactions with sources. I was getting scoops, really big stories, and I just felt like I was 26 at the time. I just felt like if I was going to have a career in journalism, competing with people 10 years older than me for scoops on Uber was not a path that I was going to win at. I thought that, hey, I'm a little bit smart. No one else seems to be taking this seriously. So why don't I do this? So I put together a pitch, for editor-in-chief right as Business Insider was launching a subscription vertical. I thought that this could be a good B2B vertical. That was the lens we were going to take on it. They liked the pitch, and the rest was history. That was 2017, and I was on the beat at BI for almost 6 years, and that brought me to where I am today.
Yeah, yada yada yada. You're here today, and I'm excited to be on this journey with you. And I don't know if you recall, but it wasn't it might have been 2017, but more likely early 2018. You and I had a coffee in Toronto to sort of get the lay of the land of each other, but also start a friendship with eventually, again, yada yada yada, to Cultivated Media now. And we'll obviously hear more from you on a weekly basis. We're going to try to do this every Wednesday, you and I. But you want to just jump into the news with that as a prelude?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm ready.
Yeah. So in today's newsletter, and this I like because I am from New England. You have New England roots as well.
I do.
There are 6 New England states. 5 of them are legal and really well on their way. The only holdout is New Hampshire, which New Hampshire does stand out sometimes as sort of a outlier in New England. But they, I think it's tomorrow, will be taking up a bill, a legalization bill in their state house. Whether it passes or not is almost irrelevant. I think it's really a if not when in New Hampshire, but it'll be a purely New Hampshire type of play, likely with sort of state-owned stores or dispensaries, much like they do with alcohol. Anybody who's driven through New Hampshire has seen a state liquor store on the highway, ironically, and it's sort of where libertarianism meets governments wanting to make money and keep control. That's how I would describe New Hampshire. Right, live free or die, unless you want to buy booze, in which case we're going to sell it to you on the highway in coolers. So there's that happening in New Hampshire, but concurrently, same day of the news, Rhode Island is implementing or wants to implement via the governor something that would allow cannabis businesses to essentially write off tax expenses that they would otherwise have to pay via 280E or sort of backfill that. It's like an interesting juxtaposition of what's happening in New England this week, Jeremy, no?
Yeah, no, absolutely. With New Hampshire's case, you never want to predict that a political process is a done deal. But I think all signs are pointing in that direction, right? It's funny. I went to college in Maine, and we used to drive across the New Hampshire border just to buy booze because it was tax-free. And so we really sort of lived and died by their state ethos. But I do think like New Hampshire it has that libertarian streak that you alluded to. It does have a Republican governor who isn't necessarily a friend of the cannabis industry, but I think understands that, look, New England is a very small region. If your neighbors have legalized cannabis, it's pretty impossible to control the flow of that through your state, and you might as well capture that tax revenue. I think that's where he is coming from. And I think, look, the rest of New England is like that too. In the Northeast, every state is close together. It's really hard to kind of control and set policies that don't affect the states around them because, these metro areas are so far interlinked. Think of the tri-state area, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania. And so, yeah, I do think it's almost a done deal. And I think that, the entire Northeastern bloc will be a green bloc within this year.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of what the pressure Pennsylvania is feeling right now, and that is different and apart from what happened in the West, right? California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, like those places, the inter-border travel's actually much less than New England. Just thinking about it that way, and then states are having trouble. Like Pennsylvania doesn't want to lose out to the other states. We saw the governor there, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, talk about he's already included it in his sort of budget for the coming years. New Hampshire, I think, will get there as well, especially in a low tax state like New Hampshire. You need to tax something, and it might as well be alcohol, or might as well be cannabis.
Yeah, I think there is sort of, and there's this is not my brilliant idea. There's been some sort of talk and thinking about this, about, harmonizing the cannabis tax policy across states. And I think that is difficult, when you have states, maybe like New Hampshire and Vermont, which have very different ideas about tax policy and how they pursue these policies. At the same time, like it would make a lot of sense where people wouldn't necessarily shop for cheaper product. Like if you live in Connecticut and you're getting a better deal in New York or vice versa, you're going to take that deal every single time. And so I think it probably behooves a lot of these administrations to start thinking about how can we harmonize this, and how can we also think about things like interstate commerce, right? Given the federal government's reticence to do it, also what we've seen in other states, how they've said, like, as soon as the DOJ rules on this, we're going to do this. I think, there should be some forward thinking about that in the Northeast, for sure.
Which brings us to the state you live in, and actually a neighboring one too, because there was a story 2 weeks ago that there was a glut of cannabis in New York and nowhere to sell it. And there was places to sell it in Connecticut and no cannabis, right? It was sort of a tale of two jurisdictions, but literally across the road, sometimes on the same road as each other. But this week, there's been lots, and over the past, I would say, month, and this is what I want to sort of get your take on. There seems to be more grumbling publicly about the rollout of cannabis in New York. We had the governor, you're going to correct me when I get this wrong, but the governor called it a disaster, the rollout. Yeah. Tremaine Wright said it's been a rocky start to cannabis in 2024, although I think the rocky start started well before 2024. And then we had Chris Alexander, I think in the same article, saying, we knew that there would be some increase in illegal or illicit sales, which was happening in every other market. But because this is New York, it's more. Are we like in the early stages of like a dismantling of what is currently happening in New York? Or is this like bumps in the road?
Yeah, it's a really thick question. And let me take it piece by piece. One, I think, yes, absolutely. There is a lot more acknowledgement and interest from the outside that things are not going well. I think for the past year, there was a bit of a grace period, where I think the governor and I think some outside agencies and even, some cannabis companies acknowledge that, look, what New York is trying to do is hard. It's different. It's going to take some time. That grace period is definitely now over, right? The governor has to wear this. She didn't come up with the rules, but she has to kind of own it as the chief of the state. And so, look, I think she wants changes. I think Tremaine Wright, the Cannabis Control Board chair, acknowledging it in the meeting last Friday that things are rocky. That's sort of a new tack for her. I think Chris Alexander also acknowledging that to the New York Magazine, widely read magazine, is also a new tack for him. That being said, I think with all due respect to him, like that's the understatement of the century, that the illicit market is a problem. I mean, it's everywhere. And it's not necessarily like, I think some people sort of idealize what the illicit market is, like your local grower growing some really good weed that just wants to sell it. I think it's, people shipping products from California illegally, and they're ending up in bodegas or empty, storefronts that have been left empty from the pandemic that people have just opened, like Zazu Wazoo, weed shop or something, with crazy high potency products. So anyways, so I do think that the tone is shifting. Will heads roll? I mean, I have no real reported information to say that, although I do think it wouldn't be surprising to see some changes at the top. But look, they did, like, to give them a little credit, because I think no one does, right? They did announce 109 new licenses. That will go a long way. It's a drop in the bucket, but it's more than they had before. Stores are opening. I mean, finally, the first legal dispensary seems like it's about to open in my neighborhood. It's, one of about 20 illegal dispensaries, but, it's coming. And so things are happening. Things are just happening very, very slowly. And people are rightfully upset about that.
I think that's fair. I did an event. I was thinking about this as you were talking. I did an event in Brooklyn, I don't know, 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe. And the first thing I said was I had driven from my house to the airport in Toronto to New York. I didn't drive, but I flew, and then got to the event in Brooklyn. And I said, I'm coming from the future. There is a future where there are dispensaries, legal dispensaries, many of them on the same blocks where they're allowed, right? And that does start to chip into to how, where, and why people buy cannabis and who buys cannabis, all those things. It's just, I think folks in New York thought that future would be faster, but you just sort of touched on it. Like, what is the cannabis scenario in your neighborhood in Brooklyn?
Yeah, well, every bodega, if you ask nicely, has weed behind the counter. A lot of it is just like loose weed. Some of it's good, some of it's pretty terrible. And you can pretty tell that evidently.
Right.
There's a lot of bootleg vapes being sold. There's a lot of, legal or they call them legal edibles, but they have like 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams of THC per. Obviously, those are not legal and regulated. So look, it's freely available. It's everywhere. It's super cheap. And I don't think the bodega guys really care about paying taxes or asking for IDs. It could be my receding hairline. I've never been asked for an ID in my neighborhood about it. So I don't know if that's them or me.
You look young, not that young though. No.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm just out of the range of getting ID'd these days. But look, it's everywhere. If you want it, it's there. And just thinking about, basic economics, it's going to be very hard for someone to come into the market and offer maybe a less potent product for more money, and create more barriers to actually achieving that product, which is you got to wait, you got to get your ID checked. I don't know. It seems like a really big uphill battle without some enforcement closing down these stores.
I think that's part of it, of course, but the other is, and we can. I had never thought this, but the rules and regulations were set up in a market for a market that existed a year or two ago, right? Not for a market that exists today with this sort of bodega network of cannabis shops, right? And so what are the tweaks, changes, updates that might need to be made to make it viable in the new context that weren't the same years ago? I don't know how they actually do that, because I think regulators tend to want to regulate, and tax people want to collect taxes. But it is something to consider as sort of New York rolls out.
Yeah, look, I'm not a policymaker, right? I can only say from my outside reported perspective, but I think there are some easy things that you can do. One is like getting more legal stores into the market, and that seems simple, but you need to have some incentive to do that, right? And I think one way to incentivize that participation is like cutting red tape, right? It's so hard to do the license application, to get the license. You have to own the real estate, right? And that's expensive. It creates a lot of overhead. I think that there's just so few organizations willing to now jump into this mess right now. So I think one is like you need more licenses in, and a way to do that is cut bureaucracy. Number two is harmonize the tax code, right? Like let these stores compete with the illicit market. I've seen some thinking about even doing a tax freeze on legal stores, saying they don't have to pay tax for 3 years, like let them sell their product. I don't know if I would go that far personally, but it's a good idea, right? Like you just need them to have them compete. And then number three, I hate to say recriminalize cannabis, right? But enforcement is needed. And I think Chris Alexander, the head of the OCM, even alluded to that the cops aren't really doing their job. They just assumed that this is a state-created mess. You legalized weed, so we don't care anymore, right? Maybe that's not true, but at the same time, no one's really taking responsibility for enforcement. Like the OCM has a little understaffed division that can do it, but there's just not enough people. The NYPD doesn't really want to do it. They don't really have the enforcement tools. The governor wants something to be done, but they can't really figure out what mechanism triggers the right amount of enforcement. So I think if you do those three things, less taxes, less red tape, more enforcement, I sound like a conservative. I'm not, but I do think that you really need to think about this stuff as you're sort of developing a market over time. And some of these are short-term fixes, right? It doesn't mean that social equity has to go away. It just means that without quick, easy, legal consumer access, all these social equity goals are going to fall apart, because that needs to underpin everything. Now, some people will disagree with me, but all the evidence, despite my own personal proclivities to liking social equity and cheering for what New York is doing, shows me that the rules of capitalism and market forces demand that New York shift its ways a little bit.
Oh, that was like a perfect 30 seconds of like personal beliefs, business school, and journalism all wrapped into one. Jeremy, I want to thank you for joining us for episode 2. We're calling it. We'll be back here tomorrow with Krista Raymer from Katrina Group, talking about cannabis retail and sort of what makes it successful. But Jeremy, thank you for being here, and we'll connect with you next Wednesday.
Awesome. That was fun, Jay. Thank you.